Java or yeah, they're really into their Java.
Hello, everyone. Can we head towards our seats so we can get started here in a bit?
Yeah. Basically.
Explain the levers. I'm gonna go grab food.
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to start talking while you're all finding your seats because you're not here to see me anyways. My name is Jordan. Welcome, everyone, to the Ember SF Meetup. It's been a very, very long time since we have had one. Thank you so much to Square for being gracious enough to host this. It's very hard to find hosts sometimes, so it's really awesome to be here and see your beautiful space. And with that, I'm going to hand things off to Annie.
Welcome to Square, everyone. We're very happy to host this Ember Meetup. So as you know, we are actually a big fan. We use Ember a lot at the company, but we haven't been as big, as involved in the community as we'd like to. So I'm Annie. I'm an engineering manager at Square. I manage the regular platform team. What we do is Square has many products, and we collect data from all these products onto the platform. And on top of it, we build business operations tools. So things that run compliance, risk all across the company. And all of that is built with the newest Ember. And so Lenny will be sharing later on how we manage a lot of that with Ember add-ons and engines. But first, we have Christian from the appointments team talking about his perspective being a new developer in Ember.
Woo! Thanks, Annie. What do I do? Oh, there's a cable here.
Just whiteboard it.
Oh.
This.
Right?
Mary, do we just present? Go present. Okay.
Good stage whisper.
Excuse me, I'm new here.
Is this not the right meeting room?
No, I'm in the wrong account.
Oh.
Join the Hangout in the calendar invite.
Okay, yeah. Join the Hangout on the calendar invite.
Woo!
Good stuff.
So if you need to use the restrooms, you can walk down this hall to the right, and then there's an opening on the right.
Oh.
Great.
Yay.
Nice shot.
Should we select?
Cool. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Yeah, it works. I'm Christian Schlensker. That's my Twitter handle. Like Annie said, I'm on the appointments team. And if you don't know what the appointments team is, we maintain the Square application that assists merchants who are appointment-based, or their business is based around appointments. So the prototypical example of that is, say, like a hairstylist or a barber or a dog groomer run by cats. It's all hair-based. There are other non-hair-based businesses in there too, but I'm thrilled to be able to speak to you tonight. It's mostly, I'm a little surprised actually, because I only started here a month ago, and I've also only been using Ember less than that amount of time. So I'm very new to this community. before joining Square, I did mostly React.js for a couple of years. And before that, I did a lot of AngularJS and Ruby on Rails. And before that, I did a lot of Backbone.js and Ruby on Rails. Before that, I did PHP. Before that, I did iOS and Objective-C. Before that, I did more PHP. Before that, I did ASP.NET and C#. And before that, I was kind of rocking it as a graphic designer. And before that, I was a professional cake eater. So why did I join Square? Well, on the one hand, I was thrilled to have the opportunity to join Square because I was always enamored with the product, and I heard a lot of great things about the engineering organization and the culture here. But I was a little hesitant about the prospect of abandoning my cushy React ecosystem and working on Ember. But so what am I doing here? Well, I wanted to tell you about how I eventually came around to Ember, and also some of my hot takes about it from the perspective of a React developer, because I think it's important when you're onboarding to a new ecosystem or a new organization to document these things, that before the warm fuzzy Stockholm syndrome sets in and you get used to it, that you need to write down like what your feelings are, because I mean, they're probably real, and the pain points you're feeling could help the next generation get onboarded faster. And then the third thing I want to talk about is just sort of the learning process I've been using to onboard as quickly as possible. So before I start with some of the negative opinions, it's like there's a management technique to start with something positive before you start with something negative. But before I even do that, I want to start with a brief divergence. Does anybody know who this is? This is Ward Cunningham, and he's best known for a couple things. The first thing he's known for is that he invented the wiki, and this is the Wikipedia page about the wiki. Featuring Ward Cunningham. So it's very meta. The second thing he's known for, which is apt based on the first thing that he's known for, which is called Cunningham's Law. And Cunningham's Law states that the best way to get the right answer on the internet is not to ask the question, but it's to post the wrong answer. And as software engineers, this is very intuitive to us, especially if you ever spent any amount of time on Reddit or Hacker News. But I know this guy, Swizzik Teller, who's actually a prolific content creator in the React community. His screencast taught me everything I know about using D3 with React, but he turned me onto this concept of the Cunningham technique for learning, and especially this blog post, which is the Cunningham's Law for Human Motivation, which tells you how you can sort of rephrase your questions to better elicit better feedback and to hook into this human psychology to get better answers. And so this talk here is actually part of my learning process. So what I'm going to do tonight is offer a lot of opinions. And like most semi-formed opinions, they are going to be semi-wrong. But hopefully you will be able to correct me about some of these. And if nothing else, I will consider this talk a success if I learn something tonight. So let's, like I said, I was going to start with something good, and that is conventions. So at first, it seemed like all the Ember conventions would be very restrictive, but they're actually pretty great. I found that the conventions are extremely helpful for offering portability, especially like in a large organization that like at Square, we have a lot of projects that are based on Ember, and it's just extremely powerful to allow people to jump onto a project and just immediately kind of know what the architecture is. And they also have this benefit of just eliminating a lot of arguments, that having the ability to fall back on those conventions, that it allows you to just forget about a lot of the bike shedding and just go with what the conventions are telling you. It's similar to like why we use this. Whoa, I jumped ahead a lot. Why we use this tool called Prettier, which is a very powerful code formatter. It's also very opinionated about how to format code. And I mean, I don't agree with all of its opinions, but I don't disagree enough to not use it. because it's nice to be able to rally around some sort of standardization. And I don't want to have to go back to the old days of arguing about what kind of spaces we need between curly braces or enough to stop using it. So, I mean, another area where conventions help is just with maintainability. And with regards to code, it's like, especially like when you have like a lot of people working on a project, I mean, it's not hard to imagine several programmers working on a large project with their own unique artistic flair for writing code, and possibly leaving and the new programmers joining. It could turn into a big mess. And that's not to say that React, you couldn't have conventions, but for any large project to be successful, you need to have conventions. And the only question is whether or not you build them yourself or you outsource them to your framework. And React has been traditionally very blasé about how you build your app. It just it didn't care how you did it. It was up to you. As just left you to decide what you were going to do for large swaths of your application. It's more of a library than a framework. But so that means that the community was left up to experiment and come up with their own ideas of how to organize things. And this led to a lot of innovation, which is nice, but it also meant that a lot of experiments were abandoned, and you could find yourself left. It led to a lot of churn in the community. And this is like a big pain point in JavaScript in general. And a lot of these experiments were just abandoned, and you were left marooned with whatever technology you had chosen and had to fend for yourself. And I remember, like, especially in the early days, that like it seemed like every single week there was a new way to manage your state in your application. So speaking of state management, I remember learning React and Redux, and that there was a lot of new, unusual concepts with this. For instance, you had to learn the flux pattern, you had to learn reducers and action creators and thunks, and these were very non-typical of what most programmers were used to. Whereas MVC, it's boring, but it's familiar. So, like, especially having like a Rails experience, I could just like jump onto an Ember application, hop on the Rails, and it's just like, yeah, I know what's going on here. This looks like something I know. I mean, even though I didn't know like the details of what was going on, it's like the architecture was very predictable. And that reminds me, like, of it seems like Ember has a very different priority from React, which Ember's priority seems to be keeping you productive no matter what. So they could focus on that and then look at the other communities and just adopt the technologies that made sense and just assimilate those into an Ember without upsetting the balance of things or the productivity. So some of the things that they have been adopting are like the whole component paradigm, or the routable components, or the angle bracket syntax, which is just started getting adopted here at some projects, and also even GraphQL. So the next pain point I had was that there's just so much framework to learn. There's just so much. Compared to React, it's just a huge API surface area. Like when you're learning Ember, there's just a lot of Ember specific constructs. Like you have routes, you have controllers, you have components, you have views, you have mix-ins, you have helpers, you have templates, you have add-ons, you have applications and services and objects and models and engines and Ember array. I'm not sure why Ember array exists. I'm assuming it's a good reason. Like maybe there's some like limitation with JavaScript arrays, and let's face it, like it's not hard to understand why there might be some limitations with JavaScript. It's a very funky language, but I mean, it kind of sucks that I have to learn these very Ember specific things. I can't use my general JavaScript knowledge when onboarding to this new framework. Versus like React is very minimal. Like when you're doing React development, it's like everything's a component. It's just everything's a component. There's components everywhere. And the component API itself is also very minimal. You have basically 6 lifecycle methods, most of which you don't use for most components. Like you really just use just the render method for a lot of them. And you have a couple instance properties to get the state of the world. Like you have the props and the state, and then you have one method to mutate the state. And then, I mean, this is not a fair comparison because like in a real application, I mean, you need some kind of routing. But if you use the router, the React router, I mean, you just get a bunch more components. So like these are components that routes to other components. And for state management, more components. It's components all the way down pretty much. So React has done a great job of making like the component system so flexible that you can do just about anything with it. And Ember can do something similar. And in fact, there's this great blog post that Lenny told me about, which is Ember as a component service framework by Sirach. By Sirach, which this blog post advocates how to use Ember in a more stripped down way and just use small parts of it to just use it in a more React-like way. It's a really interesting blog post. I recommend it. The next pain point I have is that sometimes Ember feels a little bit too implicit. Like there's a lot of magic in Ember, and magic is great when you're it allows you to make a lot of changes really fast, especially when you're prototyping with very minimal code. But sometimes magic is not great. A lot of times it adds a lot of confusion to things, and especially when you're debugging. Like I've been in a situation where I see 2 import statements of different modules. And this might be a little bit of an extreme example specific to our project, but I see these 2 modules and they look like they are kind of siblings. Like, okay, the business module is coming from the business models folder and the computed module is coming from utils computed, but they're actually coming from very different places. Like one is coming from a completely different repo. And it's difficult to track these down. And in a large application, you spend way more time debugging code than actually writing it, I found. And so in these cases, I find that like magic is not helpful. And you want to be more explicit than less explicit. So on a similar vein, I've noticed that in Ember application, there tends to be a little bit too many implicit global dependencies. And the reason this is a problem is that like all the global helpers and the components, it makes it difficult, especially in like template code, to know what the dependencies are when you are looking at a template. And so if you're trying to break up an application into a lot of smaller parts, that it's hard to know just by looking at it what the dependencies are because they're all global. And but in like React, like the templates and the component classes are the same file. So everything in a template that a template needs is imported explicitly. I have like just a little demo to show this. Hopefully it works. Ooh, okay. So this is just like a basic component file. You can see like I have like a couple dependency components here.
Make it bigger. No. Make it larger.
How's that?
Nice.
Okay.
That's squinty.
So if, for instance, I say forgot this import, my editor tells me, says, I don't know what that is. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll remember that. Or if I wanted to go see how this works, I could just go to the definition and see it exactly because it knows exactly where it is because it's imported explicitly. Or if, say, I wanted to refactor this and move this into a components folder, because it knows how this works, it knows what to do with it and just renamed it. So I don't have that bug in production of it couldn't find the thing because it could statically analyze the template itself and know how to move it. Or if I spell something wrong, it knows that it's not there. Or if I deleted it, it would, if I say like, oh, I don't need this thing, I'm just going to delete it, it would break immediately in like the CI system because it's no longer available. And I do kind of miss that explicit nature. And this there are some proposals to change this. Like, for instance, there's like in the module unification proposal, there's the proposal to add this use syntax to templates so that you actually have explicit imports in your templates. But that's kind of a long way off. And I'm not sure how well that would work with the generic tooling because it is kind of Ember specific. So the next thing I want to talk about, interoperability. How are we on time?
Like 20 minutes.
Okay. I'll skip interoperability. I'm just going to run down some things that I love. Glimmer is fast. I love it. It's technologically interesting. It's built in Rust. Cool. The community is nice and helpful. I love it. Broccoli is fast, but I miss the hot module reloading. Decorators and classes, love it. The fact that the community is all in on TypeScript, like Ember is being rewritten in TypeScript, is lovely. And also, a lot of my pain points are getting resolved. I like where the framework is going. I watched the keynote at EmberConf, and that's kind of convinced me to like look at it again seriously. So I want to talk briefly about some of the techniques I've used for learning. I did the tutorial. It was good, but it seemed like it is just not enough. Especially, I was a little scared off by this section about JavaScript primer. So this blog post by Jen Weber was great. It was more focused towards existing JavaScript engineers, how to learn Ember. This is the blog post to use if you are a JavaScript engineer and you are joining an existing Ember project and you just need to learn it really fast. The other practice I've been using is passive consumption, which this is something I took on even before I joined. This is great for learning new frameworks. This is just if you need to have a low effort way to gather information without necessarily focusing entirely on it. So you can just subscribe to newsletters and just have links go by and then stick them in your pocket for anything that looks interesting, like the Ember Times newsletter, the Ember Weekly newsletter. The Ember Weekend podcast is great because it gives you some opinions on what the prevailing community sentiments are. Following people on Twitter. These are the people I've been following. I just started following, added them and to just get some ideas of what's going on. And this is also just good to do just to break out of your bubble because like I said, I hadn't really heard about Ember for 5 years since I last looked at it. And if you want to I think it's good to just have some people in other communities that you're following and prioritize people that are just posting interesting stuff. So some people, non-Ember people that are good to follow, or Sunil Pai, who does a lot of things about JavaScript and compilers in general. Shirley Wu, who does a lot about React and D3 and DataViz, and also just posted a lot of good art, which is just fun to look at even if you're not interested in the technology. Sarah Ito, which is good for the Vue community. She also is working at Microsoft now and does a lot of tooling things, SVG animations, and her dog is really cute. So it's just fun to see good, cute dog photos. And of course, Dan Abramov, who's on the React core team, posts a lot about React and also just music recommendations. And he also has this other great tidbit, which is the best way to learn a technology is to open his tag on Stack Overflow and just start helping people. And it's just a nice quote, I think. The other great way to learn Ember really fast is just to work on a big Ember project. And if you don't have one, we're actually hiring. So, so come join us. Thank you. I don't think we have time for Q&A, but if you want to come fight me about any of these opinions, I would be happy to fight you over them. But I think Lenny is going to come on and soften up the ground a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was super informative. I'm sure everyone here can agree that it's always awesome to get perspectives from people who are new to the community. We'll take a quick 5-minute break if people want to get more drinks, snacks, or go to the bathroom real quick. And then if you have any community announcements or if you're hiring or anything, we'll do that right before we start Lenny's talk. So go ahead and take a break real quick.
If you're looking for bathrooms, go out the door, make a right, make another right.
Grab somebody with a pink badge if you need to. We all work here.
What was I gonna say about interoperability?
Not my job. Not my
You're done. Cut off.
What does it do? Like, what's
That's a good one.
But yeah, we were like, probably I don't do that.
Yeah, it's probably a good idea. Everybody has a story. They tried it.
Right. I mean, yeah. I mean, I feel like it would be.
Yeah.
My plan was. Personally. But it's also like
Yeah, and so like, I have no perspective. I'm just like, you know?
yeah, it was like
Really? I think it's worse now. Like whatever the Jour one is. Yeah.
I don't know much about it, but I think it's fun. I thought it was.
My friend called us the ugly stepchild. Yeah, that's what like. I think I said Ember was like the. I'm sure if I actually had solar rails, I would use well
to Portland for the conference.
Our experience is at some point, well, I just know I think it's like you're thinking it's possible.
If everyone can take their seats, do we have anyone who has a community announcement? Anybody here who's hiring that wants to say a few quick words about their company, anything like that? Open floor. Yes. Come on up. You can just hand it to the next person when you're done.
Hi, my name is Steve. I am working at a small seed stage startup. Actually, a couple X Square employees there. So if you would like to come and be the next X Square employee, or sorry, I knew I shouldn't have said that. Or some other place employee, we are building the platform that 90% of web apps will be built on in the future. We have a couple of Ember apps, and it's really fun, challenging meta work. And come talk to me. Who else? It's called Boundless Labs. Sorry. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jordan. I'm from Woflow. We have a software that basically augments humans for the workflow to transcribe restaurant menus for the food delivery service. We're a total Ember app, Rails backend, and we're hiring. So come talk to me.
What's up, guys? How's everybody doing tonight? Woo! That was a better woo than I was expecting. My name is Mary. I work for Square. We're hiring too. You will find a lot of teams with a Rails backend. You will also find some teams with a Java backend. You will find a lot of teams with an Ember frontend. You all are Ember enthusiasts, presumably. Don't really know. Maybe you just wandered in here. Maybe you thought you were at a different meetup. I don't know. Anyway, I represent Square Recruiting. This is not a recruiting event. This is a meetup. But if you want to work for Square, come talk to me. I will tell you all the things. And can we have another round of applause for Christian and for Annie? And Jordan. Thanks, guys. Looks like...
One more shameless plug?
Yeah, do the thing, Brad.
I do another Square shameless plug. I'm from the Square New York office. We do a bunch of Ember work there. The Square for Restaurants team is hiring Ember engineers right now. But there's a bunch of Square offices all over the world. Atlanta, Waterloo, Melbourne. So if you think like San Francisco, maybe you're like, I might want to try something else for a little while. There's a lot of options at Square as well for that. So I'm happy to talk about Square in New York and other places.
I'm not selling out or anything, but I will say that Square's interview process is pretty cool. So check it out if you're interested. But with that, Lenny. Hello.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday!
Happy birthday. Especially if that's me.
All right. Thanks so much for being here. Really excited to have the first Ember meetup at Square. We've been trying to do this for a long time. A big thanks to Annie for just sheer force of will making this happen. It's very cool. Thanks for showing up. This will be a little bit of an interesting bookend. Christian's only been here a month. I've been here 5 years as of last week, I think. And I didn't do it. Thank you. I didn't do any Ember development before that. And so this is 5 years experience. It's been really interesting. Now I do have code in production that's 5 years old, and I'm regretting it so much. And this is some of the stuff that I'm really excited to give based on some of that learning. So I want to talk about really big Ember applications. Square has some enormous ones, and some of the things that we've started to do. This is kind of early stage stuff, but started to really try to take advantage of Ember CLI as much as we can to make these Ember applications easier to manage in the long run. So, a little introduction. Lenny Burdette. Don't really do social media, so find me on GitHub or in the Discord. Hopefully the person who talked to me on Discord is actually here too this afternoon. And I wanted to note that I wrote a blog post back in March on the Square Engineering blog, which you should definitely follow if you don't. Tons of interesting topics besides Ember there. But this is an extension of that blog post. I'm not going to go too much into the depths of the Yarn topic here, but you can get some good information there. So I'm going to talk about 2 of Square's biggest Ember applications as context. I'm going to talk about the problems that we face when we're developing these big applications. I have a demo app. The applications are too big to show off in a 30-minute meeting. So I have a demo app that I'm going to walk through to show the structure that we're aiming for, talk about how you can convert an application to the structure, and some things that we've learned, things to watch out for. So, and feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions at any point in the talk. The first application I want to talk about is the one I wrote the blog post about. It's called Dashboard. Very generic names within Square because it's Square Dashboard, but I just call it Dashboard. It is probably not the biggest Ember application in the world, but it's up there. And it's probably not the oldest Ember application in the world, but it's up there because it started on Sprout Core way before Ember existed. And it has been a continuous code base that entire time. It is a really unique combination of big and old. So
the biggest, oldest.
Sorry?
That's probably the biggest, oldest.
You think, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that was the point I was trying to make for sure. It's what I spent most of my time in at Square. The important things to note about this application are it's a platform for sure. It's the application itself isn't that interesting. It's the different sections of the application. There's sales reports and employee management and customer directory is the one I worked on for a long time, and dozens and dozens of other sections. And they're all owned by different teams that often act very independently. And so, but it's all one application, one cohesive experience. And we really emphasize keeping that cohesive experience. We've never stopped and rewritten this application. We don't break it up into pieces because all the transitions need to be in-page transitions and stuff like that. And that's why we make very small gradual changes to this application over time. We migrated to Ember CLI last year finally. And it has been a continuous code base, which is a big selling point for Ember, I think, over this period of time. Since I wrote that blog post, though, I've actually switched teams, Danny's team. And I now work on an app called Regulator. It's actually very similar, except it's internal only, so I can't show too much about it. It's for risk and compliance, customer support. It is, again, a platform. So it's a large application contributed to by people from all over the company. And this one, unfortunately, has received far less love than Dashboard. It is a very old stack. It's not super fun to work in. So we're actually rewriting it to be a brand new Ember CLI application. It's on 3.5. It's using the structure that I'm going to talk about in this talk that really takes advantage of Ember CLI. And so I'm coming at this from 2 perspectives. One is we have an existing app. We want to make it easier to work in. And we have a new app that we know is going to get really, really big. It's going to be a platform, and we want it to stay easy to work in like it is when it's a brand new application. So what are the problems that we face when building big applications? The first set are going to be super obvious to everyone here. Big applications compile very slowly. Library load times suck. It's really frustrating to develop them as these huge applications. We also have a very test-driven culture at Square. So there are far more lines of test code than there are application code. And when you make a change to Dashboard, you're running everyone's tests because it's one big test suite. And that can be very slow. It used to be like an hour for a test build. It's now significantly smaller than that, but it could be a lot better. It is also, we deploy daily. It's a monolithic deploy. That does mean that if one team introduces a bug, we roll back everybody's code. And that's not fun. I am not going to solve that in this talk, just worth mentioning. The next set of problems I think are far more interesting, a lot more subtle. Try my best to explain them. So if you're in a browser, single JavaScript environment, you're in an Ember application, single Ember resolver. There's really only one big place to put all the code. And so all these teams are stepping on each other's toes. And the first way we're going to have to solve this is probably just namespacing. We have a lot of prefixes for our components. We did the subfolder thing for components, which is going away, so I regret that. And that solution works for a while, but it does kind of fall apart over time, and it doesn't add any real structure to your application. So, and the thing that tends to happen more often when one team has written a component, for instance, like a menu or something like that, the payments team made a menu, and the employees team is like, we need a menu. It's very similar. The designers talk to each other and design them the same. They're going to often just try to reuse that first menu because it exists in the code base, so they can see it right there. And they're going to add some API. They're going to add some edge cases. Now that component is significantly harder to understand. And the next team is going to do the same thing because it's already been used twice. You're just going to have all these premature abstractions, right? Root of all evil. And that not only makes everything harder to understand within this code base, but it couples those two teams together. If the payments team needs to make a change, they're going to have to figure out how the employees team is going to react to that change, or introduce a bug that the employees team wasn't expecting, which is not fun. So this is the most insidious part, I think, of a gigantic application, and the thing that I'm most interested in solving. But there is a whole other category of problems I want to talk about. Also, pretty obvious things. It's really unclear who owns what code in this code base because it's just folders with hundreds of files, right? That's really overwhelming to new people, especially new people. Like Christian hasn't even written an Ember application when he comes in here, and he's both learning how Ember works and how dashboards Ember works. And that's tough. And then the next 2 points are my favorite parts of this part. Over the course of the last 7 years, Ember has changed dramatically. The best practices have evolved a lot. And we've done an okay job at keeping up with those best practices, but there's definitely some really old stuff in the code base. There's many ways to solve the same problem. And so that's also overwhelming for someone new. How do I actually do this when there's like 3 ways of doing it? And it also makes it so it's hard to experiment. Like we're looking at Ember concurrency for dashboard, but we already solve asynchronous tasks in so many ways. Ember concurrency is heavyweight. It's a really great solution, but it's just a 4th or 5th way of doing this, and you're going to get some pushback. I push back a lot when people want to add new add-ons to dashboard because we've already solved these problems so many times. So experimentation gets really hard. And then finally, this is the last of the problems I want to talk about. Code review is tough. We bless a few people. I think it's like 15 or 20 of the 100 contributors or so with the rights to approve because they've kept up with these best practices. They paid attention to how things have changed over the course of the application. And that's really frustrating for the people who are waiting to get their stuff approved, and for the people who have an inbox full of PRs they don't even understand who need to approve them. So these are the things that I want to try to solve using a structure that I'm going to cover here. But before I get into that, there's 2 concepts that kind of underlie my philosophy behind why I think the structure is worth approaching. And the first one is my favorite architectural term, composition. When you have a really, really complex user interface, you can definitely just put all that stuff in one template. We've all done it. That controller template just has every piece of it. But we know, especially after React has kind of taught us about component-driven design, that we should break up our UI into smaller pieces and then compose the whole UI up of those smaller pieces. And there are good and bad ways of doing this. Partials are no one's favorite way of building up a large UI, right? They don't give you actually enough structure. They don't make it clear how data is flowing through your UI. So you can do it, but it's not a great way to do it. Components are the right way of breaking up a complex UI into pieces. They're more powerful API. They're a little bit more difficult to learn. But they're inherently composable. You can make components out of other components. You can yield contextual components and all these powerful features in more recent version of Ember. So I think that is going to be a well understood way of breaking up a UI. So I want to take that same thought process and apply it to the entire application as a whole. If you have a gigantic application and you want to break it down into smaller pieces and compose the application of those pieces. What is your unit of composition, right? And what we've tended to do for a while is just namespacing and folders and kind of just, it's basically partials for your file system, right? It doesn't really give you any structure. It doesn't really help you understand how your data is flowing through the application. So what is a better way of doing that? Anybody have any ideas where I'm going to go with this? Add-ons, yeah. Well, NPM packages, really. Like NPM package, we all build our applications up of packages. Like they're inherently composable. They take a little bit more time to learn how the whole registry system works, how packages are loaded by the system. Add-ons and Embers, add-ons and engines are just special kinds of Ember packages. Also take a little time to learn, but they're really, really powerful. So what we're starting to do is try to use them fully to make these applications easy to reason about. And the other concept I wanted to talk about, another law, just because we talked about making sure we both had someone's law in our talk. Conway's law kind of says that our applications tend to mimic the structure of our organizations. And sometimes this is used pejoratively, like we don't want this to happen. But I think in a case of a well-factored monolith, you actually want to take advantage of this. You want the pieces, the component pieces of your application to follow along team lines so that teams can move more independently. And that's how you start to identify what those pieces should be. So I'm going to go into a demo application because it's a lot easier to do that than show off the full application. Okay, here's my demo. It's not exciting. I've got two sections here. This is kind of dashboard-y. Got a global navigation up at the top, two sections. One section has a table and a form. And the other section has a table, a form, and this nonsensical D3 graph. That's all the demo. Like it's not interesting. You can imagine this being built as a single application very easily. It's a handful of routes, handful of components, nothing interesting there. But the way I built it is with the idea that we'll, 5 years down the line, have 35, 40, 50 sections, all contributed by different teams. There'll be hundreds of components instead of a dozen. That's what we want to structure application for, to set ourselves up for success. So let me walk through the code a little bit. This is that visible?
Yep.
I'll make it work. So what I actually have here is 5 different Ember CLI projects all in one folder. It's a monorepo instead of a monolith. I have a host application, I have 2 engines, and 2 add-ons. And all of these projects are just Ember new or Ember add-on, like the plain boilerplate. Like I didn't do anything interesting. But I did -- skip git because I didn't want a different Git repository for each one. So I put them all together. And I have this set up so that if I'm, for instance, on the employee management team and I need to make a change to this, this is a separate engine. And I'm running the host application here. If I want to make a change to this template, for instance, not that one, just add some exclamation points. Live reload picks up, it refreshes. It's as if it's one application. Is that cool? I thought that was really, really cool when I discovered this back in, I want to say, November of last year. I've been working on Dashboard for a really long time. We were finally on Ember CLI, and I was like, how can we really make this awesome? And that's when Yarn Workspaces landed. Has anybody used Yarn Workspaces yet? A little bit? Yeah. So Yarn comes out of Facebook, right? And they have a monorepo. Everything goes into one repository as far as I understand. So all of their tools are very much built for monorepos. And this Yarn Workspace is what allows you to glue together a bunch of NPM packages without having to do any NPM link dances, which if you've done that before is awful. It's not a fun way to develop things concurrently. And it's really, really simple to use. It's so simple, it's like I have to stop and like this is going to be cool. To make a Yarn workspace, I'll have this folder with several different NPM packages in them. They each have their own package.json, like any other Ember CLI project. But I have a top-level package.json that very simple. We just list out what our workspaces are. We can list it out with its single folder, or we can use glob patterns to say any directory within this folder is an NPM package, you should pick it up. And what Yarn does when you run yarn install is it does two things. It hoists all the dependencies up. So they're actually all installed up here outside of the individual projects. And that's already cool because it reduces file system usage. There's not an Ember source within each project. But more importantly, within this host application, I have a dependency on this common components add-on that sits right here. And when I go into the node modules folder, scroll down really, really far. This is VS Code's symbol for symlink. So it automatically stitched together every single package that's on disk within this folder together. It doesn't go to the internet for common components. It just finds it on disk. And then NPM does its, and Ember CLI do their normal thing. They'd find the files exactly where they are. And Ember CLI is smart enough to understand, like, when this file changes, we're going to go ahead and refresh the app. It's really, really cool. When we introduced this, I don't think anybody noticed. You know, that was the coolest thing. It kept our development flow exactly the same, but now we have this new power of breaking up our application to smaller pieces and composing it back up. So I think at that point, we've actually solved like a whole bunch of the problems, or at least allowed our teams to solve them a lot more. I think code ownership becomes clear because the employee management team owns this employees engine. And I think that it's a lot less overwhelming because if you're a new member, engineering team member of the employee management team, you're only going to be looking within this engine. You're not going to see hundreds of files. You're just going to see the components that relate to this engine. So it's a lot less overwhelming. And this doesn't solve the problem, but I think it provides an avenue to solve the problem for refactoring for best practices and experimentation. If the employee management team decides that they're going to change everything to Ember concurrency, they do so only within their engine. The engine can have its own dependencies, can have its own Babel config, all that kind of stuff. And so they can set it up just for themselves and refactor their code base. So there's only one way of doing something. And then in terms of experimentation, like, they can say now to the payment infrastructure team, like, hey, we did this cool thing. It worked great. You should try it too. And now that team decides to refactor it whenever their roadmap allows them. So I'm just going to go ahead and mark these off as fixed. But it does go a bit further than that. Within add-ons and engines, if you didn't know this already, there's automatically generated a dummy app. And so when you go into the employees engine folder and you run Ember serve, you'll actually get this dummy app. And what I've done is set up the dummy app so it routes that same engine right at slash, like at the root. And this is, I have all these running all at the same time. This is the employees engine running it by itself. So there's no more global nav because that's owned by the host application. And but it's a full-fledged engine, like you can do everything you want. And this, I think, automatically solves that slow build time. Like, you're only building the stuff for this engine, not the other engines and not the host application. And so this allows this team to focus on what they're doing within this engine and set up their development story in whatever way it fits their team. And so I've actually set up like different fake data in this. Like, if your Ember CLI Mirage config is different for this engine, you can do that. And I'm like exercising, like, what if the data is actually invalid? You know, for any other engineer who wants to kind of jump between sections and see how the whole thing works, maybe you don't want to have invalid data like that. But within the employee management team, I want to make sure we're seeing all the use cases. So I've kind of got this set up especially for that team. I also have the payments engine running Ember serve here as well. Very similar setup. And so from here, I want to talk about the namespacing issue, because the coolest thing about engines, really the power of engines, is it creates a new namespace. Within an engine, you can, well, my example here is that I have a table in each one. They look very similar, but they're different. They have some styling differences. If they were more complicated, they might have some behavior differences. And if this is all built into one application, one of them would probably be called payments table and one of them called employees table. And that works up to a point, right? Like 10 years down, 5 years down the line, there's going to be way too many of them. And what I did here instead is the employees table is just called table, because we have single word components now. which I don't know if you use this. It's amazing. So it's just the table. And the payments engine, it's just table. Like these two teams no longer step on each other's toes. And I think that's really, really powerful. So I'm going to go ahead and mark off single namespace. I think it's also, this again doesn't solve the problem, but I think it makes it easier to do the right thing. It's less likely these two teams are going to prematurely abstract things because you're probably not even paying attention to the other team most on a day-to-day basis. So these two teams can build their own solutions, and then you need to have another like kind of cultural solution, like a regular meetup to talk about how are we all sharing, solving things, and how should we actually start sharing solutions. And these two teams are definitely not coupled together. I'm not even really going to talk about the fact that engines are lazy loadable. That's like a side effect of the fact that it's a new namespace. That's not the point of engines. It's the fact that we have clear boundaries between parts of our application. 2 more points I want to make in this demo. I do have some shared componentry. So the payments and employees engines both share a silly little text input component that handles label and everything. And there are definitely parts of your application you want to be shared. And to create a consistent experience, forms should probably act the same way across your whole application. And so when the employees engineer is coming in here and wants to add a new variation of the text input, they're not going to find it within their engine. They're going to find it here in the common components add-on. And the component add-on has a dummy app as well. And what I've done, just to kind of demonstrate, is that my add-on is kind of a style guide. It shows every variation of this component all at once. And this is the style guide or storybook-driven development that when the Storybook project came out, which apparently now works with Ember, so go check that out. I was like, this is the way I want to work forever. I want to work on things in isolation. I want to know exactly how each variation works. I want to see them all at once. So if I'm coming here to add a 5th variation, I can do it so with confidence that I'm not going to break another team because I'm seeing all the other variations. This is not only a development tool, but also a documentation of the public API for this component. And there are add-ons for doing style guides, but you can do this just with the dummy app. Here's all the buttons that Bootstrap provides. So I think that's really powerful. And the final thing I want to talk about involves this little graph. I did D3 because every time I jump into D3, I've completely forgotten how it worked. Like it doesn't fit my mental model. I'm sure this is familiar. So when I was building this and spending way too much time building this, because it's not the most important part of my demo, I built it actually as a separate add-on. It's not an add-on meant to be shared, but what this gave me was the ability to focus on this component and set up some different fake data for it, make sure that things are aligned, do things that are unrealistic in the actual application. You can definitely, because this is all stitched together with Yarn Workspaces, you can definitely do this within the engine. You can even do it within the host application, but you're paying penalties for doing so. Instead, I'm going to make a one-off add-on just for this component, and it's just really nice to do this. I'm doing this more and more in the new Regulator app. All our global navigation is actually, which has a lot of complexity, is separate add-ons, even though it could just be built in the application. So that's my demo. How do I do on the, oh yeah, check that one off. There's 2 things that the demo doesn't really show that I wanted to kind of cover in terms of how we're solving our problems. So this is kind of a diagram of this project. Host application, it's a real Ember application, depends on 2 engines. And those engines have a shared dependency, and then there's an extra one that kind of sits up on the side. And so in terms of the 2 other problems, it's slow CI times and long review times. What's cool about this is that because these projects are basically independent projects that just happen to live in the same repository, if we're a payments team engineer and we make changes just to this application, this engine, who cares other than the people on that team? So eventually, I don't think we're going to have this model where there's only a blessed set of people that can code review. It's really only going to be the people that work on this code and know it intimately, and code review is going to be so much faster. We know it's not going to affect the employees team because of the hard isolation walls of engines. And when we run this in CI, if we teach our CI system about dependency trees, we only have to run the tests for the payments engine and anything that depends on it. So right here, we've eliminated 60% of our tests. That PR gets gets through really fast. And if this was 20 sections, we'd be eliminating 95% of our tests or more. And it's the same thing with the shared add-on. So if the shared add-on isn't owned by a particular team, or maybe there's a platform team that owns it, when you make changes to that, code review needs to be a little bit more careful, and we need to run tests for more of the application. But the more you split off your application into smaller pieces, the fewer tests you're going to run. So that's the demo. How'd that go? Is that pretty cool?
Yeah.
So if I've convinced you and you have an existing application, you're like, I know this is going to get really big, or it's already big, and we want to go down this path. These are the steps that you can take to do so. This is, again, I'm coming from two places. Dashboard is a gigantic application. We've barely started turning the ship in this direction, making baby steps. The new regulator UI is in this structure already, so I have a lot of confidence that it's going to last for a long time. The first thing you're going to do is convert your project to a Yarn workspace. I just looked yesterday. NPM is supposed to have workspaces in version 7, maybe early next year or something. So if you don't like Yarn, I love Yarn. You may be able to wait for this, but I'm not sure exactly how they're going to work. But you convert to a Yarn workspace. The blog post I talked about has the steps for doing that. The next step is the most vague and the hardest. But if you do this well, everything after this is going to be much easier. And that's to remove any unnecessary coupling with your app. This is a really big problem for Dashboard because we started back in Ember globals well before ES6 modules even existed. So there's actually a lot of global state. And anytime there's global state, it's going to make it really hard to break things apart. And what I say here is just copy paste code. It's going to bloat your application temporarily, but you'll fix that, especially when you move to lazy engines and you're not downloading everything at once. The next thing you want to do is identify the dependencies that should be shared. I call these diamond dependencies because this is your graph, right? Common components are the bottom of the diamond. And you can't extract the payments engine, for instance, if there are still things that it depends on in the host application, because your arrow would go the wrong direction. That doesn't work. Your test would fail because they're trying to look for things that it doesn't have any, it can't find. So once you've identified those dependencies, then you convert them into add-ons. And one thing that we're doing with Dashboard is we actually have an add-on that's just called the junk drawer. We're just throwing everything that's shared that just blocks us from being able to extract pieces. And it's a okay pattern. Hasn't given us problems yet. And then the other pro tip here is that when you pull a component or a service into an add-on, from the host application's perspective, it hasn't changed. It still is going to refer to it with the same name. So you can actually leave your tests in the host application and migrate them in a second step, which just means that you're moving fewer files at once and you have a little more confidence in this refactoring. And acceptance tests will probably stay, certain acceptance tests will probably stay in your host application forever to make sure everything's glued together correctly. And then finally, I wish I could be more specific with this, but we haven't done a lot of this yet. Once you've actually moved all the dependencies out, then you can actually convert routes to engines. And that's really probably the bulk of the work. It kind of depends. Yeah, we haven't done this enough to have more to say, but that would be the process. Just to end, a few things that we've learned, things to watch out for if you do go down this path. First thing is engines are not perfect, for sure. There's a lot of foot guns. There's a lot of problems with them. When you're starting with a brand new application and you stick to Ember conventions very diligently, it's probably going to work fine. The regulator application, we're not having too many problems, except with the testing APIs, but that's a known problem that will probably be solved in the future. But if you're starting with an existing application, maybe you've diverged from Ember best practices, there might be some places that you need to refactor before you can switch to engines. The other one is that boilerplate is very repetitive across all these projects. The linting config, all the testing setup, all that kind of stuff. It's tough to keep that consistent throughout the whole project, even on our smaller regulator app. What we're doing there is, as much as possible, breaking that into smaller packages. Like all our linting config is actually in small npm packages within our monorepo. And so we don't have to repeat. Our ESLint RCE files are very short. I really like this next point because this was one of the most fun things I learned about Ember CLI while I was working on this. NPM inherently allows you to install 2 versions of a package, right? You can have one engine that depends on add-on version A and another that depends on add-on version B. And as much as possible, Yarn's going to like coalesce that, but if they're breaking changes, you can install 2 versions. But at runtime, like Ember CLI will pick one of those versions to build into your application. And as far as I can tell, it's non-deterministic. Like it may be file system order. I don't really know which one it's going to pick. It could lead to some surprises. But the way to solve this is that the Ember CLI dependency lint add-on can be installed in the host application. It gives you more tests to tell you when you have version conflicts, and then you can fix those before merging your change. I wish I had more time to talk about CSS because this is a super interesting topic. When you have an engine, especially a lazy engine load, it'll pull in its CSS. But when you navigate to another route, that CSS is not unloaded. It stays in the page forever. I don't know if this is something they may change, but I think we can solve this even with that constraint, and it does mean you're not going to have to download it again. The way we're handling this right now, at the add-on level, CSS modules seem to be a pretty good solution. Creates strict isolation per component. But at the route level, you don't really have, it's a little bit harder to use that. So what we're doing is adding a top-level wrapper div with a class name and scoping all of our selectors within that class. And you can do that with Sass very easily. And finally, there are some projects that don't understand workspaces, things that make assumptions about the file system. This used to be a really big problem. It's actually one of the things I'm most proud of. Once we got to Ember CLI, we could start contributing back to the community, and the first things we fixed, we helped fix. Ed Faulkner did most of it. But the first things we helped fix were making Ember CLI aware of Yarn Workspaces. And so most things work great. A few complicated things don't. I have to, this might be outdated information. It's possible that these 2 things actually work fine now. And just the final thing out of this, now that we have our application broken up into packages, we can start publishing those packages. This is not my intention. Like my intention is actually just make this one application easier to develop in. But the coolest thing is that now these things are broken up into small pieces that are very well isolated and defined, have a strong public API, and we can publish them to the open source community. We can publish them to internal registries. Dashboards, core, styling, and components have already been extracted into an add-on that we use throughout the company. And we did that without interfering with the development process of Dashboard. No one really noticed the difference as they're making changes for their product. But now we have the superpower of being able to publish things. And Regulator actually uses all the core styling from Dashboard, which made it really easy to get off the ground and make that application work well. So that's, I mean, not even the big point, but like it's a super cool benefit to this process. So that's all I have. The project and the slides are on my GitHub. So yeah, Lenny Burdette. And yeah, that's it. We'll answer some questions afterwards, but I think that's the rest of this. That's the end of this meetup. So thank you.
Cool. We'll have about 40 minutes to an hour for everyone to network, enjoy the rest of the food if there's any left. But thanks for coming today. Happy to chat with anyone. I'm sure Lenny and Christian are here as well to answer any questions you have.
Feed the food.
Yes, great question.
I just have a question about, so people haven't been involved in add-ons and engines. I'm looking into it, but wondering how you made the choice between, because as I understand, an engine is essentially an add-on, and so how you differentiate between that and the choices you made in this.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question is, how do you choose whether you're going to pull stuff out into an engine or an add-on? And pretty much for this demo, it's whether it's routable and whether it fits along team lines. So the idea, like add-ons create a namespace, but they then re-export everything into the global namespace. So it doesn't really create hard isolation between things. Whereas engines truly create, like one engine cannot load, does not see components and services from another engine or anything it doesn't directly depend on. So the isolation that engines provide is the stronger point for why breaking up a large application into smaller pieces for teams to work independently is really powerful. Good question.
2 things.
If you're using NPM or for whatever reason you don't want to use Yarn Workspaces, you can use in-repo add-ons for add-ons and just kind of do .. the path to make those load. So that's what we're doing. When I looked at Workspaces a little over a year ago, it wasn't as good as it is now. And the other thing is, I wanted to ask, do you have your data models in a shared component or add-on rather, so that you can kind of use them everywhere?
Yeah. To the first point, I kind of didn't talk about in-repo add-ons specifically. It is definitely something you can do today. I had a quick chat with Robert Jackson, and I think we're on the same page. Like, if Workspaces existed several years ago, in-repo add-ons wouldn't exist. Like, they're not real packages. They don't have their own test suite and all that kind of stuff. So you can get some benefits, but not all the benefits if you go that direction. And to your other question about models, we're still exploring that with the dashboard app, which has hundreds of models. And I think the solution is probably going to be, we're going to just move all the models into one package. It's our data model package. It doesn't help create isolation between teams, but our data model is so tightly coupled already that we just have to deal with that. Regulator UI, the new application, is actually using GraphQL, which doesn't have model classes. So that's one reason why I'm a big fan of GraphQL. We don't need the way that models are stitched together is in the API layer, not in JavaScript classes. That's a huge reason why I picked that technology to work towards. But great question.
So you talked a lot about the sort of diamond dependency pattern. Obviously, as you add more engines, that sort of widens out as you get more and more paths between your common dependencies and the main app. How do you manage publishing changes and updating versions across all of the engines that depend on your common dependencies and then the app that depends on the engines without that becoming a huge pain point?
And you're talking within this particular application within the Monolith.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. So I should have brought this up. Cool. The packages within the monorepo have a really specific version, which is 0. Not a publishable version. It's not valid somewhere. But this is actually what the blueprint does. I did this by accident, and I thought this was great. And so when I depend on something within the monorepo, I leave it at 0. I don't put a tilde or anything like that. This tells us this is in repo in addition to telling Yarn. And this is different when you start publishing. And what we tend to do there, I think, is just greater than. So that it's continually walk forward. Yarn will aggressively look for what's on disk before it goes to the internet. So it will use Ember ranges to figure out what it should do. And you can, if you do have part of your application that's languishing and still looking at depending on an older version, except for the part where I talked about Ember CLI dependency limit, technically you would be allowed to go to the internet just for that version, but depends on whether it's an add-on or an NPM package. Because if it's an add-on, Ember CLI will dedupe. But Yarn is smart enough to know what to do there.
So I only have perspective as a package and add-on maintainer that a third of the tickets for add-ons are because they're deeply nested. Someone's using the add-on in a deeply nested way or in an engine. Are you seeing that from the perspective of someone using engines, that all the add-ons are broken, or is it just that it's just something that's getting worked out?
Not within these monorepos, no. But we haven't pushed the limits yet. So
you haven't depended on add-on that's a dependency of your add-on inside your monorepo.
So that's actually an excellent point.
For instance, Ember Font Awesome is a good choice inside a monorepo add-on.
Yeah. So there are cases where you just can't resolve the dependency when it's deeper than your direct dependency. And we have one case where that is one place where that's the case. Ember assigned polyfill has changed a couple times. This is Yarn's current solution. I'm hoping that they come up with a better one for transitive dependencies, but this is Yarn's current solution. If you need to force it to install a particular dependency for something's deeply nested, you can do so at the top level and say, every time, anything that depends on Ember assigned polyfill, resolve it to this version, no matter what the parent actually says. That is a super technical topic, and wasn't planning on getting to, but it's a great question.
All right. So how you said the test/CI story is hard. Like, how have you kind of solved when it goes to CI, it runs all of the engines, tests, and Jour?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, because I don't have a good answer. Because our in-house CI, it's a system we wrote ourselves. It's technically open source, but I don't think anybody else uses it. So we just taught it how to traverse the package.json tree. And I don't know how you do that with Travis, but I'd be happy to.
So it just traverses the tree and runs a test for that one and that one and that one. And then in the host app, are you able to run tests that depend on engines? Like if I have an acceptance test in my host app,
Well, basically we have it set up. The host app tests will always run, and so especially in the new application, we're trying to keep the host application tests very minimal and very high level, because they will always run. Because anytime you change something, the host app has a dependency on that thing. So, yeah, that is a good point.
You mentioned, sorry,
No.
You mentioned this as a caveat, but in the future, say regulators the host app, and there's say 20-something engines of teams that build into regulator. The dummy app, when we build something new in the host app, all 20 of those dummy apps have to be updated. And since this talk is all about the split of responsibility, how do we, as the Strike Init platform, push out 20 different dummy apps? Is it more like an engineering solution, or is it more of a product issue?
I don't know. We're going to figure that out. I think that we're going to basically create an add-on that is a minimal, all the minimal requirements for every dummy app. And so you'll install that as a dev dependency of every engine, and that means it's a dependency of the dummy app. And you still have to wire things up a bit, but you can at least have all your core dependencies ready to go. But I don't know, because we haven't made that many engines yet, but we're going to.
I want to follow up on the earlier question. So for people who are interested in trying out this approach, what are some common pitfalls that you might find with consuming add-ons in an engine, and how often have you found yourself having to submit pull requests to add-ons to fix engine-related problems?
Like in Ember interactivity?
Yeah, like that.
Yeah, the bug that we fixed in Ember activity 2 months ago?
Yeah, who did that?
It's, honestly, it's surprisingly stable. I thought it was going to be worse. It is not perfect, for sure, especially because engines, again, aren't great. And there's some things that we haven't really investigated in terms of, are all the dependencies ending up in the right vendor file, like the lazy one or the host application? And we're just kind of hand-waving that for a little while. Yeah, that's if you do want to split your stuff along add-on lines, you'll run into fewer problems than if you split along engine lines, but you don't get as many of the benefits. So it's a great point. I see what you're saying now too.
I recall reading that Ember engines are going to be basically subsumed by Ember, primary Ember source. Do you know what the plan for that is, or are you concerned at all about migrating when that time comes? Or I guess it's probably pretty far future.
Yeah, it's definitely a good question. How stable engines are going to be in the future. The coolest thing about engines is that the core part of engines, the runtime part, is in Ember source. Ember engines, the add-on, is actually just the build time part. Okay. And it was the same, they're called engines because Rails engines happen first, and Rails engines are exactly the same way. They did this big refactoring of the Rails framework to make Rails itself is an engine that hosts itself, and then you can add other engines to it. It's literally the same thing with Ember. But the packager is a big mess, and it's pre 1.0 because they know it's a big mess. But the Ember CLI team is the packager API landed in 3.4, though no one's using it. And as that API gets more solidified, the idea is that packaging will just be another step. Like Ember auto import does its own custom packaging with Webpack, you'll be able to do that within the packager API without having to do crazy stuff that it does. So that's the future as far as I understand it. Again, who knows when that's going to happen. And I'm sure there will be hiccups because the packager API landed with regressions because it's really hard to refactor Ember CLI. But that's something that they fix very quickly, and I have some good confidence that it's going to land nicely. And we're out of time, so thanks for the question.
So snacks and alcohol. Please partake.
It's in my mind. You guys move back, right? I was like, wait, where's my bag? You guys can I wasn't sure if I was like, that's right.
Skeptical about engines. And I think what you described as like an input. I'm also skeptical.
Good job, Lenny.
No, I see how the engines. Yes, so your point that it's like a side effect and not is a good sentence.
Garrett, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Oh, yeah, I'm glad it worked out.
Thank you.
What is it?
I know.
Show them the I think that like, well, it's a combination of things. I saw, I'm like, oh, this isn't so bad. The second newer stuff is really cool. It was like, it's fine.
What if it's actually just lost time, all of it, she's one of architects, all of it, and that's a distribution, load LC, distributed Al Santa attack, stuff like that.
So the things I noticed in the keynote is that like most of my people have much labor. They like understand that they're all problems that are like they use for PlayStation during holiday season and that product review that
That's one of my main chats.
I became very open to the idea.
I don't think they have to.
What is it like?
For holidays, they keep the last one right.
Why about it?
Well, I still am I've learned very little. And my biggest goal so far is that like I'm not really into everything in programming. I'm basically just like changing just because there's a short same it's just like it's gonna be the dynamic stuff, but 70%. Frameworks and there's also City as well. It's like when you're working on a larger project that you need those abstractions and hard to no one questions.
Yeah. I get it.
Yeah.
That's actually
it's a difficult
Like including myself, like
maybe it was like it was cool. And
I hated Angular so much. Angular 1, I hated it so much. Not like I didn't hate it at the time, but in retrospect, yeah, I pretty much hated it. I hated it so much.
Nice. Well, yeah, I appreciate it. It's just really excellent.
Thank you.
I'm gonna keep the recording and show
Cool. Yeah. Cheers.
Yeah.
It's weird seeing myself on TV.
It's easy on everyone.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
I asked my team.
That's how you define yourself as a person. Is the white away.
In this one.
Tough kids. Yeah, for sure. So you live down there and you're up here?
Oh, no.
Okay. You just commute down there. How's that feel?
I'm better with Caltrain.
Caltrain's nice.
Yeah.
I love Caltrain.
Driving. Yeah.
I got the migration. But I only ever ride the Caltrain. Usually when we go to a soccer game at AI Stadium.
Well, yeah. So
You
that's how
like,
we
you
got
like,
there.
you just like have a beer on the train.
Yeah.
It's like,
You feel very European.
yes, very European. Yeah.
Right.
I love that about Europe so much. Just how compact everything is. Just everywhere. Yeah. Awesome.
Actually,
Yeah. Well, it's just nice being able to take like go on a plane for an hour and be in a different country. Yeah, or a train, plane or a train, It's like you can't even get a state like here.
although I'm from the East Coast, and it's like they do get that formula.
Now we're in Manhattan. It is a different vibe over there.
It was amazing. You can't take a train there.
You could probably like adjacent file.
Amtrak.
I do the same thing.
You don't like the Amtrak?
I liked it.
But I didn't want to.
You've never taken it. I was going to say, the train is a luxury way to get it. Okay.
Well, and your seats are, you can get the legroom.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely nicer. I never thought of it as a luxury.
Have you seen
I was hearing that, like, laying subway track in the United States is just
You're able to jump between.
I got out of there just to
it's like these way more.
we do have, I didn't want to strictly so you can run.
Yeah, but even if you have subways. Or whatever, it's just like we don't know how to do it. I feel like San Francisco is too close. Whenever there's some new transportation item, like go more parking garages.
Yeah. Well, that's
I feel like if the bicycle were San Francisco would find a way to make it
I'd be okay with that personally, but not for everyone. Right. I mean,
What's up, people? Is Larry? Who's back up? They're not the same companies that were here before.
Yeah.
There's like 30 companies bidding, and only 2 got them. It's not the ones that were here before, So Lime is out, Bird is out. Yeah, so it's Skip's gonna cut today. And also which do the mopeds? Those are the 2 scooter companies. Yeah. Oh yeah?
So they just make their own layer of basketball and have issues with it. Trying to get permits and like do things the right way. And there was a period where they were like,
I brought this up at the same one, just
but now it sounds like they're kind of their like work is coming through.
Yeah, yeah. They look good. They seem nice. Well, I used the bird ones before.
They were everywhere.
Yeah. I was never a shooter. I like scooters. I wish they would go bikes, yeah. But they're not everywhere.
They're not everywhere.
That's because the bike tourist companies. That's why they don't go to the marina. It's like it's because like those rental companies were like, no, we need to keep charging people $60 a day for like, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's like fuck you, we don't need you.
Right.
It's like why are we supporting these stupid rental bike companies?
Right. Yeah.
Just do the go bikes, yeah.
Yeah. No, I like those.
So corrupt.
Yeah, that's the thing I like. I want to find one. Yeah, it's not as regular. I like the regular.
I had that problem with the last incarnation. Like I would find one, but it'd be busted up. And like it's like, oh, this one, the power cable is not attached to it, so it just doesn't work. Okay, cool. This one, it doesn't have a wheel. That's nice. Okay, next one.
Yeah.
They're all over there.
Oh yeah.
They don't have. No, I was there for React Rally, and getting around there on the scooters was a lot of fun. They have like huge blocks there. It's a big car city.
Where?
Yeah. Did you watch that 99% Invisible? That 99% Invisible, yeah. The flat of Zion.
We went over.
The blocks are huge. So you look at the map, it's like, oh, it's just 1 block away. It takes like 10 minutes.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. But that's actually a great suggestion. It's relatively flat.
Yeah.
And you have this large
like a lot of room for like a bike lane.
That was the first place I saw it.
But like they have enough room so they can have bike lanes in every street. It's like almost more bike friendly this year. They're pretty well planned. You get accessible items and an automatic list. Thank you, Joseph Smith. Yeah, and Brigham Young. Looks like job. I have cousins that live there.
Fascinating city.
We still have so many tickets.
And they're really not like anywhere else.
The right balance still.
It is kind of unique. It is a unique place. Yeah. Very.
Not like there. No, yeah. Without that layer, let's get
I know everyone's gonna be you know where to look. There's some like hipstery bars that have like good beers.
Yeah. So like I said, that's probably building out of the stream.
You kind of beat me up.
That's the hardest part.
Super nice.
Stephanie. I like the ones though, like of the fundamental evangelical groups. They seem the most ideologically consistent. Like they're all like anti-Trump.
That is true. That is
like no, that's terrible. Like
you're like, wait, no, for real, it's not our values. Romney was our
Like, oh yeah. Someone had like the Twitter Jour account, which was woman for men. I know so many people from like that area. When I was in Chicago a few weeks ago, like everyone in there is like, yeah, I'm from the suburb northwest. Like it's like just where everyone's from.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, that's like the
Yeah, I guess it's publishing everything. Like you said,
couple companies I worked for, a couple companies ago where I worked, half the company was UI people.
Those people were saying, unfortunately, they didn't do that. They weren't able to find it. And people that own like enterprises, they need to be real. So think about it.
Ever watch the show? There's one episode where there was like some trans like pop star YouTube kid who was named Urbana Champagne. Yeah, it's a pretty great name. Yeah, it was good. And I just always think of that now when I think of Urbana Champagne.
Oh my god. Like I need to share that story.
Yeah, look up the pocket full of rainforest episode. Urbana Champagne. It was really good. I don't even know like how this in-joke happened. Like I guess somebody on the writing staff went to Urbana U of I and knew about Urbana Champagne.